This guy's a Pulitzer Prize winner. He's the co-founder of DCReport.org. Now he's a professor at RIT and Rochester Institute of Technology. He's the great David Cay Johnston, everybody.
Hello, Mark.
Hello, sir. So talk to me about Ukraine. Things are changing so rapidly there.
Yeah, there's some really important developments today. This morning, Reuters broke the story that Donald Trump plans to kick out 240,000 Ukrainian refugees, mostly women and children we let into the country because of the invasion by the Russians. This was done during the Biden administration. Of course, to Donald Trump, Biden's the worst president ever, and anything he did has to be terrible, except creating jobs Donald wants to claim credit for. This plan will take a while, but it's indicative of what I think is now crystal clear, that Donald Trump is favoring Russia and trying to help Russia defeat Ukraine. Day before yesterday, Donald stopped the sharing of intelligence information with the Ukrainian military. Having U.S. intelligence has been crucial to the Ukrainians' successes. And to give an idea of what's going on in this war, Russia has been losing 1,100 to 1,600 soldiers a day. And I don't mean casualties, I mean killed in action. During World War II, America, fighting wars in two theaters, lost an average of 300 soldiers a day. The Russians in the last year have had 400,000 soldiers killed, and they have gained some territory, as critics of the war keep saying. And what they've gained is 0.5% of the territory of Ukraine. Virtually nothing for that many lives. The other significant development about Ukraine is that the Australian newspapers, the newspapers of record in Australia, the Sydney Morning Herald and its sister paper, The Age in Melbourne, they have a very sharp international editor by the name of Peter Harcher. And today he said flat out that there shouldn't be any more question that Donald Trump is an agent of Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. And the evidence he offered to this is that not only has Donald used Russian propaganda talking points, and not only does everything he says is needed to have peace in Ukraine be what Vladimir Putin wants, but he notes that throughout the 4 years Biden was president, Donald, by his own account, was having telephone conversations with Putin, and that all of the countries Donald Trump has verbally attacked or threatened have in common that they are democracies that had been aligned with America against Russia: Canada, Denmark, Panama, and the semi-autonomous Greenland. And in a podcast, he provided, I thought, a lot more examples to justify this point. So I'm no longer the one journalist out there saying Donald is an asset for sure and arguably an agent of the Kremlin. And I think Harker makes a very solid argument to that effect. So think about this for a minute now. The United States of America, a beacon of liberty and democracy since 1787, has now completely abandoned that and has taken the side of a murderous dictator, the modern czar, against liberty and freedom, and right to the point of kicking out of our country the refugees we took in after Vladimir Putin 3 years ago attacked Ukraine.
It's a remarkable transition. It's a remarkable pivot. This from Vilma. Trump has also threatened the UK not to share intelligence with the Ukrainians. Any good news about the Ukrainians at all? So he's leaning on allies, traditional allies, not to fill the gaps that America is now leaving.
Right. And there's a program called Five Eyes: the United States, Canada, the UK, New Zealand, and Australia, where we do global signals intelligence, or SIGNET. I've been to Australia, where there is this place called Pine Gap. You can't get to it. You can see the signs that say Pine Gap, but it's a giant valley with this enormous array of electronic surveillance equipment to pick up signals in the air, to bounce things from satellites, and that is run in close cooperation with us. Australia has been our most loyal ally ever since World War II, more so than the Canadians and the Brits. Absolute lapdog. You know, when we say jump, they don't even ask how high; they just jump as high as they can. So for a very sober publication, or two publications, because there's a lot of rivalry between Sydney and Melbourne, to adopt the position that was put out today by Peter Harcher is an important development about what's happening in the rest of the world. I've been interviewed a couple of times now by overseas journalists, all from Europe. And the core of their questions is, what in the world is happening? And are we in danger of attack by the United States if this keeps going? Think about that. That journalists in Europe are starting to ask the question, might the United States, presumably in partnership with Russia at some point, engage in attacks on Europe because of Donald Trump? And Americans aren't seeing this. It's not being discussed in our best newspapers. The fact check by the New York Times, where I worked for many years and is, flaws and all, the best newspaper in the world. The fact check on his address to Congress was very namby-pamby and wishy-washy. He made some remark and the Times said, well, no evidence to support it. Another one, well, it's unclear. Nonsense. He made stuff up. He said $350 billion spent by Americans on the Ukraine war. It's $120 billion, a third of that. Said millions and millions of people who are obviously dead, 115 years and older, are getting Social Security. No, they're not. That's a very inexpensive software fraud prevention tool. If you're over 115, you can't get Social Security unless you show up and prove to Social Security you're still alive.
Yeah, it's the coded. It's the coded
it's just
way.
Coding and software.
Right.
Yeah. So no checks go out if your birth date is before a certain point. And his speech was just lie after dissembling, after misleading statement, after inflated number, after utter nonsense. And at the beginning of his talk, he said, "I have restored free speech in America." And then later in the show, and it was a show. Absolutely. He says, we've vanquished woke and DEI and stopped that. Well, then there isn't free speech.
Yeah. And I think the co-conspirators in the room, who applaud his every utterance, I think are, they're MIA when it comes to essentially the dismantling of government. I was saying that before you came on.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, it's not just the one guy, Musk or Trump. There are systems in place, but if those systems aren't used, then there's nothing that can. This is from Don. I hope the Euros use the frozen Russian assets to arm Ukraine. I thought this is an important point. Maybe they won't need our help. Screw Putin, he says. But what about that? There is a lot. There's a lot of money.
The European journalists, Mark, have been asking me about exactly that, and I've said I don't see any reason for you to hold back. You've got all these frozen Russian assets. Donald Trump is in the process of removing the sanctions we had put on Russia. So yeah, you should right now seize all that money and give it to Ukraine. And the basic choice I think Europeans face is Putin needs this help on his side. He has lost so many soldiers. He's sending soldiers to the front who have no training except how to clean and fire their rifle. There's a new video footage got out last night or this morning of Russian soldiers just running when they encountered a Ukrainian unit. On the other hand, the Ukrainians can't make these strikes into Russia without the help of the United States. I expect that Elon Musk will, if he hasn't already, turn off Starlink, his private U.S. taxpayer-financed satellite communications system. He did it before helping Russia.
Right. That was what the USAID investigation was all about. That's why he went against USAID initially.
Right. So, I think the Europeans recognize in the short run, if Ukraine is defeated, they're not at risk because without a single American firing a shot or dying, a single American soldier, there's some volunteers who've gone over, we have destroyed well more than half of Russia's war-making capacity. You fight a war, you need big, heavy trucks to bring things to the front. He has about 1/6 at the best, more likely 1/10 of the heavy trucks he needs. And they're so old, they break down. They can't carry full loads. Putin is, at the moment, he's getting nowhere of any significance. It's also mud season coming up, so there won't be much movement one way or the other. But if the United States was resolute, Putin could be pushed back off of Russian territory, and we could get an end to this. But that's not what's happening. Donald Trump is clearly intervening against the Ukrainian peoples in favor of this murderous dictator. In the journalists I've talked to and the TV shows I've been doing overseas, people are really, they're very shocked by this, even if they think a lot of what Trump's doing may be good stuff. That the Europeans in particular are worried, as the Canadians are. Remember, I talked in your show earlier that 11 of the Canadian premiers, governors, came to Capitol Hill week before last, and they were asking, is the U.S. going to invade Canada again? We haven't done it since 1812, but we've done it several times. That was the most recent. And they're really worried about it. Justin Trudeau has made it clear he is worried about that. And if you listen carefully to the joint congressional talk, Trump indicated he may seize Greenland. He talked about, we want you to be independent, and he said, but we need to have Greenland. And he made it clear that seizing the Panama Canal is still on his agenda.
Yeah. I mean, in the case of Canada, this unprovoked. Well, in the case of all of these various confrontations that the Trump administration is having, these are unprovoked confrontations. I mean, it's, the Canadians didn't do anything to produce this kind of vile reaction on the part of the Americans. I wanted to ask you before, I have a journalist and journalism question that relates to the White House and White House coverage that I'll get to in a second, just while I have you. But before I do, Denmark now is introducing a strategy to expedite and economize weapon supplies to Ukraine by facilitating local manufacturing within their country. It's called the Danish model. They've raised over $550 million in their first year, and they expect $1 billion this year. This would allow Ukraine to quickly produce and maintain its equipment and enhance defense capabilities, I'm seeing here, amid concerns over U.S. reliability and the Russian threat. So Denmark is offering, as Europe is, to fill that gap that we were talking about.
Tiny a country as Denmark is, about 5-6 million people. It's a key player in this because of their resolve and their horrible experience under the Nazis. And I think that we're going to find that Poland, Denmark, Germany, France, and England are going to be the key players here. None of them has a military large enough and well-equipped enough to go into the battlefield, and we don't want to have them in the battlefield with a nuclear power on the other side. What we want to do, I believe, is what we've been doing, and that is helping the Ukrainians who have shown remarkable brilliance in military strategy, fighting this war on the cheap. I mean, this will be studied in war colleges around the world 500 years from now, how they did this, no matter how the war turns out. And the problem is that the really killer weapons, and I mean literally killer weapons, have come from our country. The HIMARS artillery and the ATACMS missiles, which are incredibly accurate and lethal. And they will run through their supply of those. The HIMARS have to be refitted and refurbished after a certain number of firings. So the weaponry they can get from Europe, it will not be as lethal. On the other hand, it's probably better than what the Russians have. The Russians are getting their weaponry from North Korea, and we know that a lot of that's been junk, the mortar duds that go in all directions and don't calibrate as they're supposed to, from Iran, because the United States, in an act of idiocy going back almost 71 years, 1954, has managed to turn 1,000 years of enmity between Iran and Russia into making them partners. And but getting weaponry from the European countries, including helicopters, heavy trucks, and guns and bullets, and electronic surveillance is just going to be fundamentally essential to fill in for the United States. And what some of the Europeans are thinking is, gee, does that mean Trump will do something to us if we stand up? And the fact that we know the Trump White House has threatened the Danes, you can reasonably conclude from that they've probably had tough conversations with the French and the Germans, the Brits, and perhaps Poland about, don't you dare go help the Ukrainians.
Yeah, and I think that's precisely the kind of attitude and disposition that Trump has toward these things. He takes everything so personally. You see it even in the tariffs and the back and forth on that. So you're right. I mean, they're right to be concerned. It seems odd that you'd have to have that anxiety associated with just the kind of the personal ego that's associated with a lot of these moves on the part of Trump. But there's the Russian asset part, and then there is the kind of broken, bruised ego part of Trump that you have to account for.
Right. So before I go, one other thing. Coachella Valley coffee is very good. I was very surprised. Thank you for the package.
We sent David the Coachella Valley coffee, which is pretty terrific. Well, I have one other substantive question, and then we'll go off on a sip of the coffee together. But in the Zelensky-Trump meeting, there was that completely inappropriate question that was directed toward Zelensky by a reporter who was there. And this guy, Brian Glenn, he was the guy who asked Zelensky why he wasn't wearing a suit. I mean, even as, Churchill during World War II didn't wear a suit. There's this idea that because I'm with my men and women, my people who are fighting this battle. So the White House took this question from this new reporter. He's the one who asked that question. As it turns out, it's Marjorie Taylor Greene's boyfriend, which is,
or boyfriend du jour, apparently, based on her recent history. Yeah. And I believe he was accredited as a reporter for TASS, but maybe that was someone else. The news reports I saw were a little unclear about that.
Well, what he is, I think, is a reporter compensated by our government. Apparently, he works for a news outlet, this is in quotes, that has taken $192,000 from Donald Trump's political committees. He's paid by Donald Trump's PAC for almost $200,000 so far.
Thank you. I wasn't able to find a clear news account that I trusted about what happened there, so I appreciate that. This is very strange given how they have complained, that Politico has gotten money and Reuters and some others, and they're for subscriptions to the publications. And we have, even if they're going to get rid of regulators, the reality is that if you're the Internal Revenue Service, you really have to have a lot of people who read Tax Notes, which is a nonprofit, no ads magazine I used to be a columnist for. If you're covering banking, you've got to have subscriptions to the American Banker to know what the bankers are up to. And those aren't cheap. Trade journals are very expensive. Some of them cost $15,000 a year, and one subscription for an agency with 60,000 people, that doesn't work. You got to have a bunch of them. And that's all that's happening. These are paid subscriptions to information regulators need. But we shouldn't be surprised that Donald Trump's people have planted a propagandist posing as a journalist who's on the payroll of a Trump-affiliated organization. And of course, to Donald, there'd be nothing wrong with that because he's with him. If it was somebody paid by the Democrats, he'd be screaming bloody murder.
Yeah, and I also think that, and you kind of alluded to this when you were talking about Trump's remarks before Congress. He's about the show. He's a performer. So, of course, that guy's a prop because I'm trying to make a point and I'm trying to run down Zelensky. And so that's why that guy's there. So I get it. He's not a real journalist, but he still serves our message.
One of the things about that meeting with Zelensky, you'll remember he was asked about, why aren't you wearing a suit? Nobody asked that about Elon Musk when he had his 4-year-old with him. But what you saw there was classic Marxist-Leninist denunciation and humiliation. If you watch the Netflix TV series, The Three-Body Problem, which is from a novel published in China, I'm very surprised that Beijing allowed the novel to be published. They wouldn't allow my books to be translated in China. It opens up with a physics professor during Mao's Cultural Revolution having to wear a dunce cap and being denounced and then beaten to death. I haven't ruined the show for you folks. Trust me. It's just the opening scene.
That happens in Act 1? Man.
But yeah, it's the very first thing you see, and it becomes an important motivating factor in what happens as we discover an alien life a group that are much advanced on us, and they're coming towards us, and it's going to take them 400 years to get here. And it is a fundamental tenet of the practical application of Marxist-Leninist dictatorial theory that you must humiliate and denounce people who are not in complete obedience to you. And it was Harcher from The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald who brought this to my attention when I listened to his podcast. But he's quite right. At the time I saw this, I thought this is an ambush and it's humiliation. And there's some other goal here. And what I hadn't thought is, well, yeah, that's what Marxist-Leninists do. And it raises the question of Donald, with all of those phone calls no one was on who wasn't an American, and his meetings while president with Russians in the Oval Office that he didn't announce, where we know he gave away vital national security secrets, his one-on-one meetings or one American and a whole bunch of Russians meetings while he was president with Putin. All of those suggest that I don't think Donald is a dedicated Marxist-Leninist. He's not smart enough to be able to do that. But could they have said to him, well, you need to humiliate your opponent. You can't just disagree with him. You must denounce and humiliate. That's not hard to learn. Donald would get that. And that's what you saw happen in the Oval Office, a classic Marxist-Leninist dictatorial move.
Yeah, he doesn't have to be on board with the political philosophy or even understand it. He that humiliation thing, that's right out of. You've got a bunch of examples of him doing that, through his career.
Sure.
This is part of his game. David, love that we had this special visit with you, and I look forward to Tuesday. David Cay Johnston, everybody. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.